So today we're reading in the book of Colossians, and we're going to start in chapter 3 and pick up in verse 23. And this is what Paul is writing to the church. He says, "Work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you are serving is Christ." Now, I've heard this verse spoken many, many times, oftentimes to teenagers from parents saying, hey, when you go to your job, remember, work hard. You're not working for your boss, you're working for God. And that's true, and that's really good advice, but the truth is, Paul doesn't write this to the church so that the church would be known as people who are hard workers. In fact, it has very little to do with a work ethic, although that is important and a sub-point to what Paul's trying to write. See, if we really want to know what Paul's talking about in this chapter, in this verse right here, we really need to jump backwards into verse 16 in chapter 3. Listen to Paul, what he's writing to the church. He says this, "Let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives. Teach and counsel each other with wisdom, with all the wisdom he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do and say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father." See, the point of Paul writing this is for you to understand that you are a representative of Jesus Christ to this world. See, after Paul writes what I just read, he goes into like, hey, this is how a household should live. Like, wives should submit to your husbands. Husbands, you should love your wives. Children, you should obey your parents. Because these things are good, but also because they're a representative. Our families and us individually and us as a church are a representative to this world of who Jesus Christ is. And so when Paul writes, work hard, work not for your master, but to God, who he's actually writing that to is slaves. He says, slaves, work hard for your master, and not just when they're watching, but when they're not watching. Why would Paul write this? Because when you do this, you are representing Jesus to them. And the fact that you are working this way may be a piece of the puzzle that draws them in to Christ. So church, yes, work hard. And yes, work even when the master is watching and when he's not watching. And remember, I love what Paul writes. He says, look, see, the slaves, they didn't have any inheritance. They weren't working for a paycheck. They were working because that was their life. And Paul says, look, you have an inheritance coming from the king. God has an inheritance waiting for you. So don't worry about that. Church, don't worry about, well, it's not fair, or, I'm not getting paid my fair wages, or like whatever it is, whatever thing we come up with in our mind of why I don't need to be working hard, or why I don't need to be a good representation to the world at this moment. They spoke meanly to me. They spoke poorly to me, so I lash back out at them. It's my right. Too often, we're terrible representatives of Christ because we feel we have the right to be terrible representatives of Christ, because I have the right to not be talked to that way. I have the right to not be treated that way by my boss. But the problem is we represent Christ, and we are to represent in humility, in love, in meekness. All these things are characteristics that Jesus championed and we need to have in our lives. So church, remember this today. In all you do, whether it's at home or whether it's at work, wherever you're at, you represent Christ. And so do that. Just have that in the back of your mind. And I love what Paul writes. Remember that we're to give psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. That is through our thankfulness to God that we represent Jesus to the world. Love you guys. We'll see you soon, family. Bye.